What happens when a doctor is forced to face a reality far beyond expectations? Can racism still persist in the most extreme circumstances? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight's tale is The Black Doctor by Arthur Conan Doyle, a classic tale reimagined and retold for the modern age.
Bishop's Crossing, a quiet, almost forgotten village, tucked away just 10 miles southwest of Liverpool. In the early 1870s, this humble place became home to a man whose very presence seemed to raise questions that no one dared ask aloud. His name was Dr. Aloysius Lana, and he arrived as an enigma. No one knew where he came from or what had driven him to settle in this isolated corner of Lancashire. The villagers only knew two things with certainty. First, that he had earned his medical credentials with distinction from the University of Glasgow. Second, that there was something different about him. He wasn't like the others. Dr. Lana was a man of darker skin, with features that didn't fit the typical mold of an English country doctor. His complexion was swarthy, his hair dark as night, and his eyes sharp, almost unnervingly so, sparkling with an intensity that seemed out of place in a place as calm as Bishop's Crossing. His features carried the hint of some far-off land, perhaps India, perhaps somewhere further still. Yet his mannerisms, his bearing, all suggested a lineage that could easily have traced back to Spain. In the beginning, the locals whispered behind his back, calling him the Black Doctor of Bishop's Crossing, a term laced with mockery, even disdain. But as time passed, something began to shift. The whispers turned into nods of respect, and that same title, once a symbol of ridicule, grew into something more, something of reverence. The name of Dr. Lana spread beyond the small village, known now in the surrounding countryside as a title of honor. And how could it not be? Dr. Lana was no ordinary physician. He was a brilliant surgeon, a master of his craft, with a remarkable precision that turned even the most hopeless cases into triumphs. In a village where the local doctor, Edward Rowe, had long held a mediocre reputation, Lana's arrival was a storm. Rowe, the son of Sir William Rowe, a prestigious Liverpool consultant, had inherited his father's name but not his talent. Dr. Lana, with his undeniable skill, charm, and air of mystery, quickly overshadowed him. Soon it wasn't just his surgical talents that made him famous. A high-profile surgery involving the Honourable James Lowry, the second son of Lord Belton, thrust Dr. Lana into the heart of county society. The charming doctor, with his suave manners and conversation that captivated everyone in a room, became the talk of the elite. In a world where a lack of family and history was often seen as a barrier, Dr. Lana turned it into an advantage. His origins were shrouded in mystery, and that only made him more intriguing. His presence, his very individuality spoke volumes, and it was enough to propel him into the social circles of the rich and powerful. But something darker lingered beneath the surface. No one knew where Dr. Lana truly came from, or why he had chosen Bishop's Crossing. He was a man out of place, out of time, and though he was revered, there was an undercurrent of tension that followed him wherever he went. For some, that was a reason to admire him. For others, it was a reason to be wary. Dr. Lana was by all accounts a man with one glaring flaw, one curiosity that gnawed at the minds of those who knew him. He was unmarried. And in a small, tight-knit village like Bishop's Crossing, that was a puzzle that people couldn't help but try to solve. He lived alone in a large, well-kept house, his practice booming, his wealth quietly accumulating. Yet, despite his many qualities, Dr. Lana had never been seen with a woman by his side. In a place where every eligible bachelor seemed paired with some local lady, the doctor's solitary life became the subject of endless speculation. At first, the matchmakers swarmed, attempting to match him with one young lady after another. But as the years dragged on and Dr. Lana remained a bachelor, the whispers grew louder. Some began to wonder, was there more to the story than simply a man who was hard to please? A few even suggested, in hushed tones of course, that perhaps the doctor had a secret, perhaps even a wife, tucked away somewhere, and that his retreat to Bishop's Crossing was some sort of escape from an unfortunate past. And then, just when everyone had given up on him ever marrying, an unexpected announcement rocked the village. Dr. Lana, the quiet, enigmatic doctor, was engaged, and not just to anyone. Miss Frances Morton, the daughter of the late James Haldane Morton, the former squire of Bishop's Crossing, had agreed to marry him. Frances Morton was a figure of local renown, tall, graceful, with a fiery, impetuous spirit that commanded attention wherever she went. She had inherited her father's estate after his passing, and her brother, Arthur Morton, took the reins of the family's fortune. When Frances met Dr. Lana at a garden party, there was an instant connection. A friendship blossomed into a deep, passionate love that seemed unstoppable. The age gap, he was 37 and she was 24, was the only real topic of conversation for those who dared gossip. But aside from that, there was no reason anyone could see to question their union. Their devotion to each other was evident. The engagement, announced in February, was set to culminate in a wedding that August. But then, on June 3rd, something happened that no one could have predicted. Dr. Lana received a letter from abroad, and as small villages often go, where news travels faster than the wind itself, the local postmaster, Mr. Bankley, became the keeper of many secrets. And it seemed that this letter held a secret of its own. Dr. Lana's letter was peculiar, different in a way that no one in the village could ignore. It arrived in an envelope that wasn't like the usual ones. The handwriting was unmistakably masculine, and the postscript simply read, Buenos Aires. The stamp, too, was foreign, Argentine Republic. It was the first letter anyone had ever seen Dr. Lana receive from overseas, and that alone piqued the curiosity of those who took notice. But the letter wasn't for public consumption. It was handed over to the local postman, its mystery intact. The evening delivery on June 3rd marked the arrival of this strange piece of correspondence. The very next day, June 4th, Dr. Lana paid a visit to Miss Morton. What transpired in that meeting remained a closely guarded secret, but when he returned to his home, it was clear something had shifted. He was agitated, visibly rattled in a way that no one had ever seen before. Miss Morton, meanwhile, remained sequestered in her room all day, and her maid caught glimpses of her in tears, a sight so unlike the confident, composed woman everyone knew. By the end of the week, the village had caught wind of the changes. The engagement between Miss Morton and Dr. Lana was over, and no one quite knew why. But the rumors swirled, and they were vicious. It was said that Dr. Lana had behaved shamefully toward the young lady, and whispers of scandal echoed through the streets. Arthur Morton, Frances's brother, was reportedly so furious that he was contemplating a horsewhipping for the doctor. What had actually transpired between them? No one could say for sure, but the villagers began to speculate. Some suggested it was an affair gone wrong. Others claimed Dr. Lana had done something unforgivable. But there was one thing that seemed to confirm the worst. Dr. Lana went to great lengths to avoid Lee Hall, taking long detours to keep his distance. Even more telling, he stopped attending Sunday morning services, knowing full well that he might run into Miss Morton there.
Then came the strangest of signs, an advertisement in the Lancet, the prestigious medical journal. It announced the sale of a medical practice with no names listed, but it was widely believed to be Dr. Lana's. Had he truly decided to leave behind the place where he'd risen so swiftly to success? The village buzzed with gossip, but nothing could have prepared anyone for what would come next. On Monday, June 21st,
Everything changed. What had been a petty scandal, a tale of a broken engagement and a disgraced doctor, soon became a nationwide tragedy. The events of that evening would captivate the country, drawing attention far beyond the small village of Bishop's Crossing. But to understand the full weight of what happened that night, a little more context is necessary. The doctor's house was quiet that night, eerily so. The only occupants were his housekeeper, Mrs. Martha Woods, an elderly woman of impeccable respectability, and Mary Pilling, a young servant. The coachman and surgery boy had long since retired for the evening, and it was customary for the doctor to remain in his study, tucked away at the far end of the house, next to the surgery. This side of the house had its own entrance, separate from the rest of the household, designed for the convenience of late-night patients. The doctor often used this door to admit visitors discreetly, so the housekeeper and maid, who tended to retire early, would remain unaware. It was a routine as familiar as the ticking of the clock. But on this particular night, something felt different. At 9:30, Mrs. Woods went to the study to check on her employer. Dr. Lana was hunched over his desk, writing intently. She bid him good night, sent the maid off to bed, and returned to her duties. Time passed as she tidied the house, the minutes slipping by until the clock struck 11. By then, Mrs. Woods had retired to her room, a quarter of an hour slipping by in solitude. But just as she began to settle in, a sound pierced the silence. A cry, urgent and desperate, echoing from within the house. It wasn't a scream, but a call, unmistakably loud and clear. She froze. Her heart raced. Was it a patient in distress? But after a few moments of waiting, there was nothing. No repeat of the cry, no further sound. The house, once again, was still. With growing unease, Mrs. Woods hurried to put on her dressing gown and ran toward the doctor's study. "Who's there?" she called, tapping softly on the door. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I am here, Mrs. Woods," came a reply from inside. It sounded like her master, but something was wrong. "I beg that you leave me in peace," came the reply, harsh and commanding, the tone sharp and unrecognizable. "Go back to your room this instant." The words struck her like a blow. The voice was unmistakably his, but there was a coldness to it, a cruelty that chilled her. "I thought I heard you calling, sir," she explained, her voice quivering. But there was no answer, only silence. Confused and unsettled, Mrs. Woods returned to her room, the harshness of the exchange lingering in her mind. She glanced at the clock again. It was 11:30. What had just happened? Was it a trick of the mind? Or had she heard something more sinister? Between the hours of 11 and midnight, the silence of the house was broken by a late visitor, Mrs. Madding, the grocer's wife, who had come to consult the doctor. She was deeply worried about her husband, who had fallen dangerously ill with typhoid fever. Earlier that evening, Dr. Lana had asked her to come by for a quick check-in to update him on her husband's condition. As she approached the house, she noticed the light was still burning in the study window. Yet when she knocked at the surgery door, there was no response. She waited for several minutes, but the doctor didn't appear. Assuming he had been called out on an emergency, she turned to leave, a nagging feeling of unease creeping into her thoughts. As Mrs. Madding stepped out onto the winding drive, her eyes caught the flicker of movement. At the end of the path, near the gate, someone was coming toward her. She expected it to be Dr. Lana, perhaps returning from a call, but when the figure emerged from the shadows, her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the doctor. It was Arthur Morton, the young squire of Bishop's Crossing. Under the flickering light of the lamp, Mrs. Madding could see that something wasn't quite right. Arthur's manner was tense, almost frantic. His hand gripped a heavy hunting crop, his knuckles white from the force. He was headed straight for the gate when she spoke up. "The doctor's not in, sir," she called out. Arthur Morton stopped in his tracks, looking at her with sharp eyes. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice unusually harsh. "I knocked at the surgery door, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the mounting sense of discomfort. Arthur glanced up toward the house, eyes locking on the study window. "I see a light," he muttered, a curious edge in his tone. "That's in his study, isn't it?" "Yes, sir, but I'm sure he's out," she said, her own confusion growing. "Well, he must come in again," young Morton replied curtly, and with that he turned and disappeared through the gate. Mrs. Madding shook her head, puzzled by the encounter, but she had other worries pressing on her mind. She continued her way home, unaware that this brief moment of strange interaction would soon grow into something far darker. Later that night, at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Madding's concerns for her husband deepened. His condition had worsened suddenly, and in her panic she knew she had no choice but to call Dr. Lana immediately. As she passed through the gate once more, heading toward the road, her eyes caught something moving in the shadows. There, crouched near the laurel bushes, was a figure, a man. Mrs. Madding squinted, the lamplight barely illuminating his form. She was certain it was Arthur Morton. But her own fears for her husband pushed the unsettling sight from her mind. She couldn't waste any time. She hurried on, intent on finding the doctor and saving her husband, unaware that the encounter she had just had would lead her into a web of secrets, lies, and danger. When Mrs. Madding arrived back at the house, her heart sank. The light in the study was still burning, an oddity in itself. She had expected the doctor to be away or resting, but this only deepened her unease. She approached the surgery door and knocked softly. No response. She tried again and again. Her impatience grew, but there was still nothing, no sign of the doctor. Something didn't add up. It was unlike Dr. Lana to leave such a bright light burning if he had gone to bed or left the house. Perhaps he had simply fallen asleep at his desk. With that thought, Mrs. Madding moved to the study window and tapped gently against it. Silence. Then she noticed a small gap between the curtain and the woodwork, just enough to peer inside. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity overpowered her concern. The study was bathed in a brilliant light, casting long shadows on the floor. The table, cluttered with the doctor's books and medical instruments, was clearly in use, but there was no sign of Dr. Lana. Until, with a chilling realization, her gaze fell upon something in the far corner of the room. At first, it appeared to be a dingy white glove lying discarded on the carpet, but as Mrs. Madding's eyes adjusted to the light, her blood ran cold. The object wasn't a glove, it was the hand of a man, lifeless and splayed across the floor. A shock of horror surged through her. What had happened? What had she stumbled upon? Her breath caught in her throat. She ran to the front door and rang the bell frantically, waking Mrs. Woods, the housekeeper, from her sleep. Together, the two women hurried to the study. Mrs. Woods sent the maidservant immediately to the police station for help, though neither of them knew the full extent of the nightmare they were about to uncover. Inside the study, the reality of the scene hit them like a cold wave. Dr. Lana was sprawled on the floor, stretched out in a lifeless sprawl. His face was pale and still. There was no mistaking it. He was dead. But what had happened to him? The clues were unmistakable. His face bore the marks of violence. One eye was blackened, and his skin was bruised, mottled with the telltale signs of a struggle. His neck was marked with fresh bruises. Strangulation. The cause of death was clear. He lay there in his usual professional attire, yet something was off. He wore cloth slippers, their soles completely spotless, as if he hadn't moved far from the chair. But it was the marks on the carpet that told the true story. The floor was littered with smudges, dirt, and smears, all left by the murderer's boots. They were visible especially near the door, suggesting someone had left the scene in a hurry. It didn't take long for the police to piece together the grim details. Someone had entered the study through the surgery door, likely under the cover of darkness, and killed Dr. Lana in cold blood. The assailant had then fled the scene without leaving a trace, or so it seemed. What they knew for certain was that the killer was a man. The size of the footprints, the brutal nature of the injuries, it all pointed to one conclusion. But from that point onward, the investigation hit a wall. The clues were few, and the answers even fewer. There was no sign of robbery. Nothing valuable had been taken. Dr. Lana's gold watch was found safely in his pocket, untouched. A heavy cash box that sat in the study was locked, but it was empty. Mrs. Woods, the housekeeper, had been under the impression that the doctor kept a large sum of money there, but she had also remembered that Dr. Lana had just paid off a sizable corn bill earlier that day, in cash. Perhaps the emptiness of the box wasn't the work of a thief, after all. But there was one thing that stood out, something that sent a chill down their spines. The portrait of Miss Frances Morton, the one that had always stood proudly on the side table, was missing. Mrs. Woods had seen it there earlier that evening, but now it was gone. Why would someone take the portrait, and who would even think to do so?
And then there was the discovery of something unexpected, a green eye patch lying discarded on the floor. Mrs. Woods didn't remember seeing it before, but it seemed to be something a doctor might own. Yet there was no indication that it had anything to do with the crime. Its presence only added to the mounting sense of confusion. Suspicion began to form, and it quickly turned toward one man. Arthur Morton, the young squire, was arrested on the spot. The evidence against him, though circumstantial, was compelling. Arthur had been fiercely protective of his sister, Frances, and ever since the engagement had fallen apart, he had been heard to speak of Dr. Lana with venom in his voice. His hatred for the doctor, fueled by the breakup, had been no secret. But what truly sealed his fate was the timing. It was confirmed that Arthur had been seen entering the doctor's drive at approximately 11 o'clock that night, a hunting crop in hand. And from there, the police theory became clear. He had confronted Dr. Lana, and the doctor's exclamation, either of fear or anger, had been loud enough to reach the ears of Mrs. Woods, who had rushed to the door. It seemed too perfect, too obvious, but was it? The police had their man, but there was still so much they didn't know, so many unanswered questions that still hung heavy in the air. As Mrs. Woods descended the stairs that night, she had no idea that the conversation unfolding upstairs would soon spiral into something far darker than she could have imagined. Dr. Lana, it seemed, had made up his mind. He had decided to speak with his visitor, a confrontation that would be far more heated than anyone anticipated. He had sent Mrs. Woods back to her room, unaware that this conversation would be his last. The discussion, which had started innocuously enough, grew more and more fiery. Tension soared until finally a personal struggle ensued, one that ended with Dr. Lana losing his life. The post-mortem revealed a startling fact. Dr. Lana's heart had been much more diseased than anyone had known, an ailment he had lived with, unsuspected, until his death. This, the coroner suggested, was crucial. It meant that the injuries Dr. Lana sustained, which would have been non-lethal to a healthier man, had instead been enough to end his life. But the story didn't end there. The prosecution's theory was chilling in its simplicity. Arthur Morton, the young squire, had been the one to strike the fatal blow. After the struggle, he had taken his sister's portrait, a gesture that seemed personal, almost symbolic, and then he had slipped into the shadows, avoiding Mrs. Madding as he passed the gate. The prosecution's case was solid, with this sequence of events painting Arthur as the obvious killer. Yet there were points in his favor. The defense had their own version of events, and it was far from as clear-cut as it seemed.
Arthur Morton was well liked in the village, known for his high-spirited, impetuous nature, much like his sister, Frances. His frankness and honesty made him a beloved figure, and the idea that he could be capable of such a crime seemed impossible to many. Arthur's explanation was simple but compelling. He claimed he wanted to speak with Dr. Lana about family matters, matters that had nothing to do with his sister, a topic he stubbornly refused to discuss. When he hadn't seen the doctor by 3 in the morning, he had given up and returned home.
He didn't deny that his conversation with Dr. Lana might have been unpleasant, but he insisted that it hadn't escalated to murder. As for the doctor's death, Arthur knew no more than the constable who had arrested him. Though once an intimate friend of Dr. Lana, the relationship had soured, though Arthur refused to explain why. There were facts that worked in his favor, too. For one, it was confirmed that Dr. Lana was alive and in his study at 11:30 that night. Mrs. Woods had heard his voice clearly at that hour. This fact cast doubt on the prosecution's theory, suggesting that Arthur Morton's presence at the scene, though suspicious, might not have been as damning as it appeared. The defense team for Arthur Morton seized upon a compelling argument. What if Dr. Lana hadn't been alone when he met his end? It was a possibility that had caught the attention of the prisoner's friends. They pointed to the strange sound that had startled Mrs. Woods, a sound she had described as urgent, almost as though Dr. Lana had been in some form of distress. Add to that his harsh, uncharacteristic response to the housekeeper's knock, and it seemed to suggest that he might have been with someone at that moment. If Dr. Lana's death had occurred between the time Mrs. Woods heard his voice and when Mrs. Madding first called at the house, then the timeline of events was critical. According to this theory, it was impossible for Arthur Morton to have been the murderer, as Mrs. Madding had spoken to him after the doctor had already been killed. But if this was the case, a new, even more troubling question arose. Who else had been with Dr. Lana that night, and why would this unknown person have wanted to harm him? The defense team argued that if they could shed light on this mysterious figure, they would have gone a long way toward clearing Arthur's name. But the public, ever quick to form opinions, had already begun to voice their suspicions. The truth was, there was no solid evidence that anyone else had been in the house that night, no one but Arthur Morton. And while his motives remained clouded, they certainly didn't appear innocent. Some said that when Mrs. Madding called, Dr. Lana may have been in his room, or perhaps he had stepped out briefly. When he returned, he could have found Arthur waiting for him, but none of this was certain. A new wrinkle emerged in the case when supporters of the accused noted something important. The photograph of Frances Morton, which had been taken from Dr. Lana's study, had not been found in her brother's possession. While this might have seemed to cast suspicion on Arthur, it wasn't enough to prove anything. After all, it was perfectly possible that Arthur had destroyed it before his arrest. Then there was the question of the muddy footprints. The only tangible evidence the police had was the trail left on the carpet, but it was too blurred and indistinct to offer any clear answers. The soft fibers had muddled the footprints, making it impossible to draw any concrete conclusions from them. The only real evidence the prosecution could rely on were the muddy footprints. They weren't conclusive, but they did fit the theory that the accused had made them. And it was shown that Arthur Morton's boots were indeed quite muddy that night, a result of the heavy downpour earlier in the day. But of course, all boots would have been similarly affected by the rain, making this connection less damning than it seemed.
And so the case unfolded, a series of strange and compelling events that captivated the public's imagination. The doctor's mysterious origins, his enigmatic personality, and the passionate love affair that had preceded the tragic crime all combined to form the perfect storm of intrigue. The people of Lancashire, and indeed all of Britain, were consumed by the story.
The case of the Black Doctor of Bishop's Crossing became the subject of conversation in every pub, drawing theories from every corner. But despite the many ideas that circulated, no one, not even the sharpest minds, could have predicted the extraordinary twist that would unfold at the trial. It was the second day of the trial when the real shock came. The long, detailed reports of the case in the Lancaster Weekly still lie in front of me as I write, but I can only offer a brief overview of the events leading up to that pivotal moment. It was on the evening of the first day when Miss Frances Morton's testimony took everyone by surprise, shedding a strange and illuminating light on the case. Mr. Porlock Carr, the prosecution's sharp and meticulous counsel, had carefully laid out his facts, methodically presenting each piece of evidence. As the day wore on, it became clear just how difficult a challenge Mr. Humphrey, the defense attorney, had ahead of him. One by one, witnesses took the stand, each recounting the vehement and often violent words Arthur Morton had been heard to speak about Dr. Lana. The young squire's resentment over the alleged mistreatment of his sister had been no secret. His anger, fiery, uncontrollable, seemed to point squarely at Dr. Lana as the object of his fury. And yet, even as the case seemed to tighten around him, the audience couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The truth, whatever it was still elusive, hidden in the shadows, waiting to emerge. As the trial continued, Mrs. Madding took the stand once more, repeating her account of the late-night visit she had witnessed. Her testimony was key in painting a damning picture of Arthur Morton's actions. Another witness corroborated her statement, revealing that the prisoner knew full well that Dr. Lana was in the habit of sitting alone in the isolated wing of the house late at night. The prosecution argued that Arthur had deliberately chosen this hour, believing the doctor would be vulnerable, a target at his mercy. Then came the testimony of a servant from the Morton household. The young man reluctantly admitted that he had heard his master return home around 3 in the morning, just as Mrs. Madding had seen him lurking near the gate, hiding among the laurel bushes during her second visit. The muddy footprints, too, were heavily scrutinized, with witnesses pointing to the alleged similarity in the boot marks found at the crime scene and those belonging to the accused. By the time the prosecution closed its case at 3 o'clock, it felt as though the net had closed around Arthur Morton. The evidence was circumstantial, yes, but it was so complete, so meticulously detailed, that it seemed impossible to believe he could escape conviction, unless, of course, something entirely unexpected came to light during the defense's turn. The court took a brief recess, and when it reconvened at 4:30, the air was thick with anticipation. No one could have predicted what happened next. A ripple of shock passed through the crowded courtroom when the first witness called by the defense stepped forward. It was none other than Miss Frances Morton, the very sister of the accused. The court fell silent.
Frances had been engaged to Dr. Lana, and it was widely believed that her brother's anger over the broken engagement had driven him to murder. Until now, she had not been involved in the case. Her name had not come up in the inquest, nor had she been questioned at the police court. To see her take the stand as the first witness for the defense was a surprise that rattled everyone in the room. Frances Morton, a tall and striking brunette, stepped forward with grace, though her eyes were red and her voice trembled with emotion. She spoke quietly, but every word was crystal clear. It was obvious to everyone that she was struggling to maintain her composure. She touched briefly on her engagement to Dr. Lana, acknowledging its sudden and painful end. She explained that the split had been due to personal matters related to the doctor's family, but what came next shocked the room. "I always believed my brother's resentment toward Dr. Lana was unreasonable," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Intemperate, even." A murmur of disbelief spread through the crowd. How could Frances Morton, the woman who had been so closely involved with the doctor, make such a statement?
What could this reveal about her brother's motivations and about the case itself? The courtroom was hanging on Miss Frances Morton's every word, the silence palpable. Her testimony had seemed until now to be working against her brother. She had spoken of her lack of grievance toward Dr. Lorna, of her belief that he had acted honorably, and of how her brother, unable to see things as she did, had threatened violence against the doctor. Her efforts to bring him to reason had been in vain. Arthur had been stubborn, unable to control his emotions, particularly when it came to his sister's broken engagement. But just as the atmosphere was growing heavier and the court seemed certain of the prosecution's case, the defense's next question turned everything on its head. Mr. Humphrey, the defense counsel, leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with something sharper. "Do you believe your brother is guilty of this crime?" The judge, an elderly man with a sharp gaze, immediately interjected. "I cannot permit that question, Mr. Humphrey. We are here to decide on matters of fact, not belief." But Mr. Humphrey, unfazed, pressed on, his next question more pointed, more dangerous. "Do you know that your brother is not guilty of the death of Dr. Lorna?" There was a brief pause. Then Frances Morton, her voice calm but resolute, answered, "Yes." A ripple ran through the courtroom. The spectators leaned in, their attention riveted on the witness. The judge, sensing the gravity of the moment, watched closely as Mr. Humphrey pressed forward with his questioning. "And how do you know it, Miss Morton?" The words that followed caused a collective gasp in the room. "Because Dr. Lorna is not dead." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The revelation was so unexpected, so utterly shocking, that it took a moment for everyone to process what had just been said. The room buzzed with disbelief as the defense lawyer, poised and unflinching, pushed for more details. "How do you know, Miss Morton, that Dr. Lorna is not dead?" Mr. Humphrey's voice cut through the murmur. Frances Morton looked at him, her face a mixture of sadness and certainty. "Because I have received a letter from him since the date of his supposed death." The air in the courtroom grew thick with anticipation. A letter from the deceased doctor? Could it be possible? "And do you have this letter with you?" Mr. Humphrey asked, his eyes fixed on her. "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet but unwavering, "but I would prefer not to show it." The defense attorney's gaze sharpened. "Do you have the envelope?" "Yes," she said again, reaching into her bag and producing the letter, carefully unwrapping it to reveal the envelope. Mr. Humphrey's voice dropped to a whisper, though it carried through the silent room. "And what is the postmark?" "Liverpool," Miss Morton replied, her voice steady despite the tension. The judge leaned forward now, his interest piqued, while the crowd held its breath. "And the date?" Mr. Humphrey asked. "June the 22nd. The courtroom froze. June the 22nd. That was a full week after Dr. Lorna's supposed death. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Lorna was alive, what did this mean for the entire case? The murder, the accusation against Arthur Morton, everything was now in question. The letter was proof that something far more complex was at play than anyone had realized. Mr. Humphrey's voice sliced through the charged silence, that being the day after his alleged death. "Are you prepared to swear to this handwriting, Miss Morton?" "Certainly," Frances Morton replied, her gaze unwavering, though the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Mr. Humphrey, sensing the significance of the moment, leaned in with quiet confidence. "I am prepared to call 6 other witnesses, my lord, to testify that this letter is indeed in the handwriting of Dr. Lorna." The judge, his gavel raised but still uncertain, gave a sharp nod. "Then you must call them tomorrow."
But the prosecution was not to be outdone. Mr. Porlock Carr, his expression tight with frustration, wasted no time. "In the meantime, my lord, we claim possession of this document. We intend to obtain expert evidence to determine how far this letter is an imitation of Dr. Lana's handwriting. I need not remind the court that this theory, sprung upon us with such surprise, may well be a simple device to divert the inquiry. Miss Morton would have us believe that she has carried this letter with her throughout the inquest and the police court proceedings, yet she allowed these to continue, knowing that this letter could have ended the case at any moment." The courtroom held its breath as Mr. Humphrey turned to Frances Morton, his voice calm but insistent. "Can you explain this, Miss Morton?" Her answer came quickly, a quiet but resolute response. "Dr. Lana desired his secret to be preserved." A ripple of murmurs ran through the court, and Mr. Carr seized the opportunity, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Then why have you made this public now?" "To save my brother," she said, her words clear and defiant.
A murmur of sympathy broke out from the spectators, but the judge was quick to restore order, his voice stern and commanding. "Order in the court!" Turning to Mr. Humphrey, the judge continued, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "Admitting this line of defense, it now lies with you, Mr. Humphrey, to shed light upon the identity of the man whose body has been identified by so many as that of Dr. Lana, the very man whose death we are investigating." A juryman, his brow furrowed, spoke up. "Has anyone, up until now, expressed any doubt about the identity of the body?" Mr. Carr, with a firm glance at the jury, answered smoothly, "Not to my knowledge." Mr. Humphrey, not missing a beat, replied with quiet determination, "We hope to make the matter clear." The judge, his gavel poised, cast his gaze over the courtroom. "Then the court adjourns until tomorrow." The unfolding developments in the case sparked a frenzy of speculation among the public. With the trial still ongoing, the press was tightly controlled, but the question on everyone's lips was whether Miss Morton's extraordinary claim had any truth to it, or whether it was a desperate ruse concocted to save her brother. The implications of her statement were staggering. If, by some unimaginable chance, Dr. Lana was still alive, then he must bear responsibility for the death of the man found in his study, a man who bore such an uncanny resemblance to him. And that letter Miss Morton had refused to produce? It could be a confession of guilt. In the end, it was possible that she might have to sacrifice her former lover to save her brother from the gallows. The following morning, the courtroom was packed to overflowing. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, and a hushed murmur rippled through the crowd as Mr. Humphrey, the defense counsel, entered. His usual composure was nowhere to be found. His nervousness was palpable. Even the most skilled lawyers could not hide their emotions when they knew that the entire fate of the case hung on their next words. As he approached the opposing counsel, Mr. Humphrey exchanged a few hurried words with Mr. Porlock Carr, the prosecutor. The expression on Carr's face shifted from curiosity to shock, a look of utter astonishment. The defense counsel turned toward the judge, his face pale, but his voice steady as he addressed the court. "With the consent of the prosecution," Mr. Humphrey began, his words deliberate, "the young lady who testified the day before will not be recalled." The judge raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "But you appear, Mr. Humphrey, to have left matters in a very unsatisfactory state." Mr. Humphrey's reply was measured, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes. "Perhaps, my lord, my next witness may help to clear them up." The judge, now intrigued, motioned for the defense to proceed. "Then call your next witness." For a moment the room held its breath. The defense counsel stood, a long, deliberate pause stretching between them. Then, in a voice that cut through the tense silence, Mr. Humphrey made the announcement that sent a shiver through every person in the courtroom. "I call Dr. Aloysius Lana." The impact of those words was electric. The court, already on edge from the previous day's revelations, was stunned into a complete silence. The entire room froze, the air thick with disbelief. How could this be? The man whose very existence had been at the heart of the case, the missing doctor, had just been summoned as a witness. Whispers broke out, rippling through the crowd. The murmurs of shock and amazement grew louder as the defendant's former lover, thought to be dead, perhaps even murdered, appeared at the door. And there, in the witness box, stood Dr. Aloysius Lana himself. Those who had known him in Bishop's Crossing, those who had seen him during his brief but impactful time in the village, stared in wide-eyed astonishment. The man who now faced them was unrecognizable, gaunt and emaciated, his once confident demeanor now replaced by deep lines of weariness and care. His skin, once dark and striking, appeared pale under the harsh courtroom lights. He looked every bit the man who had disappeared without a trace, but there was something undeniably different about him now. The transformation was startling. For a moment, no one spoke. The audience was frozen in shock, unable to comprehend the incredible turn of events. Despite his melancholy bearing and despondent expression, there were few who could deny that Dr. Aloysius Lana possessed an undeniable air of distinction. Even in the dim light of the courtroom, his presence was commanding, as though he carried with him the weight of untold stories. He bowed respectfully to the judge, his gaze steady but filled with unspoken emotion. After a long pause, he spoke in a measured, almost sorrowful tone, asking for permission to make a statement. When the judge granted him the opportunity, reminding him that anything he said could be used against him, Dr. Lana bowed once more, his posture stiff but dignified. Then, with a deep breath, he began his confession. "My wish," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words, "is to hold nothing back, but to tell with perfect frankness all that occurred upon the night of June 21st. Had I known that the innocent would suffer, that so much grief would fall upon those I hold most dear, I would have come forward long ago. But there were reasons, circumstances beyond my control that kept these events from reaching the ears of those who needed to hear them." His gaze swept across the room, his eyes dark with a sorrow that seemed almost too heavy to bear. "It was never my intention for anyone else to suffer because of my actions. It was my desire that an unhappy man, a man whose fate I sealed, should vanish quietly from the world that knew him. But I did not foresee the ripple effect of my choices, and so here I stand to offer what little repair I can for the evil I have done." A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom as Dr. Lana paused, taking a moment to compose himself before continuing. "To anyone who is acquainted with the history of the Argentine Republic, the name of Lana is well known. My father, a man of noble Spanish blood, filled the highest offices in the land. He was on the verge of becoming president when his life was tragically cut short during the riots of San Juan. A brilliant future might have awaited my twin brother Ernest and me, had it not been for the financial ruin that forced us to earn our own living." He glanced toward the jury, his eyes searching for understanding. "I apologize if these details seem irrelevant, but they are a necessary prelude to the story I must now tell." Another brief pause, and the room seemed to grow quieter, if that was even possible. The tension was palpable, every person in the court hanging on his every word. "I had, as I mentioned, a twin brother named Ernest.
Dr. Lana continued, his voice dropping slightly as though the memory pained him. Our resemblance to one another was so striking that even when we were together, no one could tell us apart. Down to the smallest details, we were exactly the same. But as we grew older, this resemblance became less pronounced. Our expressions began to diverge. Still, when our faces were at rest, the differences were so subtle that even those who knew us well had difficulty distinguishing us. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, the pieces of a deeply tangled puzzle beginning to fall into place. Dr. Lana's confession had taken an unexpected turn. The man they had believed to be dead, whose murder had sent shockwaves through the small village, now stood before them, his past unfolding in ways no one could have anticipated. It does not become me to speak too much of one who is dead, especially as he was my only brother. I leave his character to those who knew him best. But there are certain truths that I must, however reluctantly, reveal, for I have to say this. In my early manhood, I conceived a horror of him, and I had every reason to. My aversion toward him was not without cause, and I stand by that feeling to this very day. Dr. Lana's eyes darkened, his face momentarily hardening as he continued. My own reputation suffered terribly because of his actions. Our striking resemblance caused people to confuse our identities more than once, and I was blamed for many of the transgressions that were not mine. Eventually, in the most disgraceful of circumstances, he managed to shift the entire blame onto me, ensuring that I became the scapegoat for everything he had done. It was this trickery, this betrayal, that forced me to leave the Argentine Republic forever. The courtroom was still, the air heavy with tension. Dr. Lana's voice was low but steady, revealing more than he had ever intended. I came to Europe, seeking refuge in the farthest corners of the continent, far from his reach. I believed that in Europe, in the quiet of a place like Bishop's Crossing, I would be free of him forever. The freedom from his hated presence was worth any sacrifice, even that of my homeland. I had enough funds to pursue my medical studies at Glasgow, and eventually I established a practice in Lancashire, convinced that I had escaped my past. He paused, the weight of what he was about to say pressing upon him. For years my hopes were realized. I was at peace. But then, one day, he found me. It was a Liverpool man, someone who had visited Buenos Aires, who put him on my trail. He had lost all his money and thought he could find refuge, or more accurately, a way to live off of mine. Knowing my horror of him, he assumed that I would be willing to buy him off. He thought I would simply give him money to disappear, to avoid the shame he would inevitably bring with him. The room was silent as Dr. Lana took a slow, deliberate breath. His fingers clenched around the edge of the witness stand as he forced himself to continue. I received a letter from him. He told me he was coming, and I knew in that moment that I could not allow him to bring ruin to those I held dear. It was a crisis in my life. I was on the verge of a delicate matter, one that could bring trouble and disgrace to those I cared for most, people who had no part in this sordid history of mine. I took steps to ensure that any consequences would fall solely on my shoulders, and that, here he glanced toward the prisoner, his voice growing tight, that was the cause of my actions. The conduct that has been so harshly judged was born of one singular motive, to shield those I loved from scandal. If scandal and disgrace came with my brother, it would be no surprise. After all, what had been would be again. Dr. Lana's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of past decisions. His eyes locked on the prisoner in the courtroom, a man whose fate was now entwined with his own. I did what I had to do, and I stand by that. But I am not the man I was then, not the man I wanted to be. The courtroom was frozen in suspense, every person hanging on his every word. What had started as a tale of family rivalry was now spiraling into something far darker, something that reached into the very core of Dr. Lana's past. My brother arrived himself one night, not long after I had received his letter. I was sitting in my study.
the house quiet and still after the servants had retired to their rooms. Then, suddenly, I heard a footstep upon the gravel outside. A moment later, I saw his face looking in at me through the window. At first, I thought it was my own reflection. We were so alike, clean-shaven, our features strikingly similar. For a fleeting moment, I even thought I was looking at myself. He had a dark patch over his eye, but beyond that, our faces were identical. It was the sort of likeness that made it difficult to distinguish one from the other. But then, as he smiled, a sardonic grin, the same one he had worn since childhood, I knew it was him. It was my brother, the one who had driven me from my homeland, the one whose reckless actions had brought disgrace upon the name I had once been proud of. The smile was a familiar cruelty, one that still haunted me. He had come, just as I feared. I went to the door and let him in. It was about 10 o'clock that night, if I remember correctly. Dr. Lana's voice quivered ever so slightly as he continued, as if he were seeing the scene unfold before him once again. When he entered the light of the lamp, I was immediately struck by the change in him. He had walked all the way from Liverpool, and it was evident that he had suffered greatly. His appearance shocked me. He looked ill, worn out, his face bruised from a scuffle with some sailors. His clothing was disheveled, a pea jacket and a flannel shirt. His boots were in tatters, barely holding together. But it wasn't just the visible signs of hardship that disturbed me. It was the look in his eyes. A man could endure physical suffering, but the look in his eyes was that of someone who had lost all reason. His eyes, they were full of rage, but more than that, they were filled with an unbearable sense of self-pity, the kind of man who feels wronged by the entire world. My medical training told me that he was suffering from some internal malady, perhaps a chronic condition, but it was clear that his mind had been corrupted by years of failure and debauchery. He wore the eye patch to cover his injury, but when he entered the room, he took it off. That was when I saw how much he had changed physically and mentally. His once handsome face was now marked with the toll of his reckless lifestyle. But it wasn't just his appearance that shocked me, it was the venom in his words. He had become something beyond the brother I once knew. He raged against me, raged against the success I had found here in England. He claimed I had been rolling in money while he had been starving in South America. He mocked me, insulted me, the same cruel taunts he had thrown at me in our youth, but now with a fury that bordered on madness. He demanded money, demanded drink, demanded anything he thought he had a right to, and all the while he spat the most vile language, accusing me of betraying him, of abandoning me. I must admit, his words stung. They struck at something deep within me, that same guilt I had carried for years. But I am a man of self-control. I am hot-tempered, yes, but in that moment I managed to remain calm. I thank God for that, because my calmness only served to enrage him more. Dr. Lana's voice quivered ever so slightly as he continued, as if he were seeing the scene unfold before him once again. My brother was like a wild animal. He paced back and forth in the room, demanding more, insulting me more. It was as if he had lost all sense of humanity. But I knew that if I lost my composure, I would be no better than he, and so I did not raise a hand against him, though every inch of my body screamed to strike him, to silence him, but I held my ground, and that, in turn, seemed only to fuel his madness.
His voice grew lower, his gaze fixed on some distant point. I knew then that I had to act. The man before me was not my brother anymore. He was a beast, consumed by hatred and jealousy, and if I let him stay, there was no telling what would happen. He raved, he cursed, shaking his fists in my face. His voice was filled with venom, with the kind of rage only a man who feels completely wronged can summon. Then, as if some unseen force had gripped him, a horrible spasm contorted his features. He suddenly clasped his hand to his side, his face twisted in pain, and with a loud cry he crumpled to the ground, collapsing at my feet. I rushed to him,
lifting him, trying to steady him. But as I stretched him out on the sofa, there was no response to my frantic calls. His skin was icy, the kind of coldness that seeps through your own bones when you touch it. His hand, which I had grasped, was clammy and lifeless. The violence of his own fury had finally claimed him. His diseased heart, weakened by years of neglect and his own reckless behavior, had given way. For a long while, I sat in stunned silence, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had once been my twin. The room around me felt distant, as if I were trapped in some horrible nightmare, unable to wake. The ticking of the clock in the corner seemed to grow louder with every passing second, filling the silence of the room. I was brought back to reality by the sound of knocking. Mrs. Woods, disturbed by that final dying cry. I quickly sent her back to bed, needing her out of the way. A short time later I heard another knock at the surgery door, the light tap of a patient seeking attention, but I didn't respond. Whoever it was, whether it was a man or a woman, it didn't matter. They soon departed. The quiet returned, and with it, the space to think. Slowly, and without much thought, a plan began to form in my mind, like an instinct, as if my body were deciding for me. I sat there, frozen for what felt like hours, until I realized that my actions had already been decided for me. When I finally stood, it was as though my own limbs had moved on their own, propelled by an unseen force, an undeniable pull toward one course of action. For years, Bishop's Crossing had felt like a suffocating weight. The town, once a place of refuge, now felt like a cage. My life here, my practice, my reputation, all of it was stained, ruined by circumstances I could never have predicted. The people here, those I had hoped would understand, had judged me harshly. I had hoped for sympathy, but I was met with pity at best, disdain at worst. And although the potential scandal surrounding my brother's return had now passed with his death, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing could ever return to the way it was. Maybe I was being overly sensitive. Maybe I had not been fair to the people who had only tried to help. But in my heart, I knew I couldn't stay here. I needed to escape, to leave everything behind. And then, in the corner of my study, there lay my twin brother's body, so much like me that, save for the slight coarseness of his features, no one would have ever known the difference. No one had seen him come, no one would miss him. It was then that the idea struck me, sharp as a dagger. It was an opportunity, a way to escape, a way to vanish from Bishop's Crossing and never look back. A perfect chance to sever all ties, to make a clean break from the past that had been suffocating me. Here was my escape, sitting right before me, in the form of a body that could easily pass for my own. No one would suspect a thing. No one would notice. Not a soul in Bishop's Crossing had seen him arrive, and no one would think twice about him leaving. And so, with a strange, cold clarity, I began to form the next steps. This was my only chance, the one opportunity I would ever get to leave this place behind and disappear into the shadows, free from the past, free from the chains that had bound me to a life I could never return to.
But as the hours passed and I sat on board the ship, the initial excitement of my escape began to wear off. A strange heaviness crept over me, a feeling that I was carrying more than just the weight of my past. There was a burden of guilt, too. The memory of my brother's face, twisted in pain as he died in front of me, lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. I had made a clean break, yes. I had left behind the small-minded, judgmental town of Bishop's Crossing, and I was free to start anew. But deep within me, I realized that the one person I could never leave behind was Francis Morton. I had been so determined to rid myself of the past, to leave the ghost of my brother, the shame and the oppression of my own name, that I had forgotten to consider the effect my disappearance would have on those I had once cared for. Frances had been so dear to me, so full of life and fire. I had loved her more deeply than I had ever allowed myself to admit, and yet, in my obsession with escaping my brother's shadow, I had cast her aside without a second thought. I had allowed our engagement to disintegrate in silence, and now, having made my escape, I was leaving her to face the consequences of my actions, the questions I had chosen to avoid. I knew that in my absence, my disappearance would have crushed her. She had loved me, and I had not loved her enough to give her the peace of mind she deserved. So, after a night spent walking the deck of the ship, tormented by the restless thoughts I had pushed away for so long, I made a decision. I would return, not to Bishop's Crossing, but to her. I would write her a letter, one final letter, explaining everything and apologizing for the pain I had caused her. I would give her the truth, and I would give myself the chance to make amends. I spent the following morning in my cabin, writing to Frances, pouring out the full story of what had happened, of my brother's return, of his death, and of the unfortunate decision that had led me to take his life in such a way. I confessed my actions without excuse, without justifying what I had done. I simply told her the truth. I knew it would come as a shock, but I also knew it was the only way to atone for the suffering I had caused her. I told her I was on my way to Corula, and that I hoped some day, far from the town that had once known us, we might meet again, free from the weight of the past. And so, with that letter sealed and sent, I left behind the memory of Bishop's Crossing and the events of June 21st. Whether Frances would ever read it, or whether she would find any peace in my words, I could not know. But I did know that it was the only thing I could do for her now, after all the harm I had caused, after all the mistakes I had made. It was the least I could offer to the woman I had loved. Dr. Alana's return to Bishop's Crossing marked a true reversal of fortune. The village, which had once been the backdrop to his darkest hours, now became the setting for his redemption. The reconciliation with Arthur Morton, once thought to be a criminal and now absolved, was profound. The two men, once torn apart by misunderstanding and guilt, now stood side by side, with the full knowledge of the events that had transpired. The accusations that had tainted Arthur's name were dropped, and the injustice that had nearly ruined him was righted. As the villagers looked on, some in disbelief, others in awe, it became clear that the story of the Black Doctor, as it had been sensationalized, was not one of death, but one of life, of second chances, of painful truths revealed, and of love surviving the most difficult of trials. The marriage of Dr. Elias Lana and Frances Morton was the final chapter in the saga. It was not a simple love story, but a complex, hard-won reunion of two souls scarred by their past, but unbroken in their capacity for forgiveness. Their wedding was a quiet, poignant affair, marked by a deep understanding of what it meant to be given a second chance at happiness. The village watched as the couple exchanged vows, no longer the young lovers caught in a web of mystery and tragedy, but two people who had endured and triumphed over their personal demons. As they left the church that day, hand in hand, the future seemed bright. No longer would Dr. Alana be the mysterious figure of gossip and suspicion,
but a man who had, through his courage and honesty, come to terms with his past and secured a new life with the woman he loved. And so the story of the Black Doctor of Bishop's Crossing came to an end. It was a tale of mistaken identity, familial ties, and the consequences of secrets kept too long. But it was also a story of redemption, of a man who had chosen to confront his past, seek forgiveness, and rebuild a life that until then had seemed forever lost.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.